It was the sort of afternoon that made one long for tweeds, toasted crumpets, and the agreeable hum of other people's troubles. Lord Peter Wimsey, however, found himself without crumpets, having declined the housekeeper's offering at Willowdene Hall on the quite spurious grounds that one never eats buttered things after the sound of a rook, don't you know? It confuses the stomach and the spirits both. The housekeeper had stared at him, uncomprehending but polite, and retreated, leaving Wimsey alone in the drawing-room with a dry sherry and the faintest aroma of charred paper threading through the open sash window. He sniffed. Not smoke from a chimney, nor the robust scorch of firewood. No, this was something subtler, more acrid, burnt linen, perhaps, or aged silk. He followed it not with his feet, but with the mild narrowing of the eyes that preceded any of Lord Peter's excursions into mischief or mystery. "Parker," he murmured aloud, addressing the absent inspector with a fondness one usually reserved for long-lost dogs or tragically deceased composers. "You'd say I was being fanciful, wouldn't you? But I'll wager you a copy of the Times crossword that smoke of that nature doesn't come from a careless scullery maid." Willowdene Hall presented itself as all English country houses should. Symmetrical, storied, and vaguely resentful of newcomers. The manor had once belonged to a minor poet of preposterous obscurity, and now belonged to his widow, Mrs. Honoria Marchbanks, whose greatest literary output was a stern letter to country life on the unwholesome vulgarity of modern garden statuary. Wimsey had not come for the scenery, nor the Marchbanks' tepid hospitality. He had come at the pleading of his sister, Lady Mary, who happened to be acquainted with a Miss Adelaide Venn, the sort of girl, Mary had noted tartly, who quotes Blake at the breakfast table and leaves toast crumbs in first editions. Miss Venn, it seemed, had been staying as a guest at Willowdene for a fortnight, ostensibly to assist Mrs. Marchbanks in cataloguing the late poet's papers. Instead, she had encountered something more pungent than forgotten verse. A locked bedroom, a burnt diary, and, though this had been whispered with charming theatricality, a scream in the night that no one else admitted hearing. Wimsey had replied by post, "Screams are rather like defective clocks, dear Mary, always blamed but never investigated properly." Still, he had motored down to Willowdene in his elegant Daimler the next morning, waving at trees as though they might vote for him, and listening to an old gramophone recording of La Traviata, which he declared absolutely essential for any decent countryside arrival. Now, in the drawing-room, he moved to the window and peered out over the rolling lawn, where a gardener clipped hedges with the slow patience of a man waiting for a ship that would never arrive. A pair of sisters played croquet with the quiet desperation of those who fear idleness even more than exercise. The croquet mallet struck the ball, but the sound came muffled, as though wrapped in wool. "Funny," Wimsey said, mostly to the window, "how murder likes to wrap itself in manners." Behind him, the heavy drawing-room door creaked open, revealing a young woman of approximately 27, in a mustard-colored jumper of insufficient charm and a skirt that had seen better tailoring. She looked vaguely accusatory. "You must be Lord Peter," she said, in the tone of one who finds titles rather tawdry. "Adelaide Venn." "Miss?" Wimsey bowed with the elaborate reverence he usually reserved for opera singers and sandwich makers. "And you must be the voice in the night," he replied. "Tell me, was it a scream like Macbeth's witches, or something more domestic? A yelp of matrimonial regret, perhaps?" Miss Venn stared at him for a beat too long. "It wasn't imagination, if that's what you're suggesting. I heard it the night before last, around 2:30. Then I smelt smoke. The next morning, Mrs. Marchbanks told me her late husband's private study had suffered an accidental flare, and now she's terribly cross that the diary for 1911 has vanished." "Curious thing for a fire to eat selectively," said Wimsey. "I suppose the fire was trained in archival science." She ignored that. "I came because I believe something's wrong. Nobody else will say it, but Willowdene has always been odd." The servants whisper about the east wing being unlucky. Doors lock themselves, and Mrs. Marchbanks has taken to muttering in Latin when she thinks no one's about. Whimsy's eyebrows performed a discreet foxtrot. Latin, eh? I once heard a curate in Wiltshire do the same. Turned out he was rehearsing for an amateur production of Medea. Still, one mustn't discount the power of a good mutter. Show me the room. Miss Venn led the way upstairs, through carpeted corridors and past portraits of various Marchbanks men, all of whom looked as though they disapproved of modernity and would prefer their descendants to wear more waistcoats. The door to the late poet's study was locked. Miss Venn produced a small brass key from her skirt pocket with the air of someone about to break into a tomb. Inside, the room bore the faint, melancholy smell of singed paper and tobacco. A desk sat squarely before a tall window, its right-hand drawer charred at the edges. The fireplace had been scrubbed aggressively, but soot lingered in the corners like guilty secrets. An empty inkwell gleamed like an unblinking eye. Whimsy examined the drawer, sniffed delicately, and then turned toward the window. He pointed to a single length of twisted iron on the sill. "Do you know," he said, "what I always find suspicious?" Miss Venn looked at him warily. "You?" "Besides that," Whimsy said cheerfully. "Twisted metal. It never warps itself, unless told to do so. I say, do you happen to know whether Mrs. Marchbanks owns a letter opener in the shape of a snake?" Miss Venn blinked. She did. "I noticed it on the library table when I arrived last week." "Splendid," said Whimsy, already half lost in his own thoughts. "Then I believe, Miss Venn, that someone has been lying, or at the very least misplacing their fire." He glanced at the window once more, where a delicate thread of soot curled up the frame like a signature. "Tell me, did anyone mention the first scream that was heard at Willowdene?" "There wasn't one." "Exactly," murmured Whimsy, "which makes this one all the more inconvenient." Miss Adelaide Venn stood very still beside the poet's desk, her eyes on the warped drawer as though it might suddenly breathe. Lord Peter, meanwhile, crouched and ran a finger delicately along the scorched wood, lifting it to his nose with a faint frown. "Camphor," he murmured. "And cedarwood, but that's to be expected in a drawer meant to guard letters from moths or morals. What's quite not expected is the faint residue of potassium nitrate." He straightened with a pop of joints. A fire that begins inside a locked drawer and somehow fails to spread beyond a tidy boundary always suggests deliberation. And deliberation, my dear Miss Venn, rarely accompanies innocent house fires. She crossed her arms. "I told Mrs. Marchbanks as much. She dismissed it, said perhaps a loose match or a forgotten taper. But what sort of person forgets they've lit fire in a drawer full of correspondence?" "A careless arsonist," Whimsy offered cheerfully, pacing toward the fireplace. "Or a very precise one. I suppose no one heard footsteps that night?" "No," she said after a moment. "At least no one said so. Mrs. Marchbanks insists she slept through it. Mr. Fanshawe, the secretary, claims he didn't stir. The maids are forbidden from gossiping about nonsense heard after dark. And the butler, Gibbs, well, he sees and hears only what suits the silverware." Whimsy chuckled. "Ah, yes. A butler immune to curiosity is like a pianist who dislikes sound. What about yourself?" "I share a room on the upper floor," she said. "I heard the scream around 2:30. That much I'm certain of. It was sharp. Female, I think. Not long, a single cry. Cut off as though someone had—" She stopped. "As though someone had what?" Her voice dipped. "Been interrupted." He nodded solemnly, then turned to examine the floor beneath the window. The thick carpet had been recently hoovered, but Whimsy's eye detected a subtle depression in the pile just below the sill. "Someone stood here, I think. Or perhaps knelt." "You believe they escaped through the window?" Whimsy shook his head. "Unlikely. The ivy would give way under pressure, and there's a terrace beneath. Besides, escaping implies guilt. I rather think our unknown visitor arrived through the door like a civilized saboteur and merely stood at the window for theatrical effect, perhaps to light something, or to exhale. Miss Venn gave him a questioning glance. He answered with a finger raised, "Don't speak, smell." They both breathed in. The scent still lingered, faint but acrid. Not merely scorched paper, but something sharper, like the ghost of a spent match. "There was a ritual to this," he said. "Not just a destruction. Whoever set that fire did so while contemplating something, perhaps a farewell, or a threat, or a confession." Whimsy turned his gaze on her. "Now that is interesting, because if it were a confession, the absence of the diary becomes more than incidental. It becomes symbolic, a refusal to let the truth out. Someone needed the record silenced." Miss Venn hesitated. "The 1911 diary, Mrs. Marchbanks mentioned her husband stopped writing poetry that year. She called it his silent decade. Said something happened, but she wouldn't say what." Whimsy brightened. "Delicious. Poets rarely go silent without scandal, heartbreak, or syphilis. I wonder which flavor our man indulged." They returned downstairs, past paintings whose eyes watched with disapproval. The drawing room had filled somewhat. Mrs. Marchbanks herself now stood by the hearth, stiff-backed, with a lace collar and a gaze like church pews, rigid, uncomfortable, and faintly judgmental. "Ah," she said, her tone a chilly nod. "You've finished rooting through the ashes of my husband's genius?" "Madam," said Whimsy, bowing, "I've never rooted through ashes without unearthing something worth quoting. May I ask whether you still possess any of your late husband's diaries?" Her eyes flickered. "Only the early years. The war and afterward he claimed weren't fit for ink." "Pity. I always find the unfit bits the most educational." She said nothing, merely motioned to a sideboard where a tea service glinted under watchful silver tongs. A man with spectacles and a distractingly symmetrical moustache stood nearby, thumbing a notebook with all the passion of a clerk decoding shoe sizes. "Mr. Fanshawe, our secretary," Mrs. Marchbanks said. "He's the only one with access to the study other than myself and the maid who dusts, which she hasn't done this week, you'll be pleased to know." Whimsy approached the secretary. "Fanshawe, is it? You look the sort who could recite a filing system in iambic pentameter. I say that with admiration." The man blinked behind thick lenses. "Thank you, I think." "You keep the keys?" "One copy. Mrs. Marchbanks holds the other." "And the drawer that burned?" Fanshawe frowned. "I never open it. He called it his vexing drawer. Said it held unfinished business, letters never sent, or poems he wanted forgotten." "Poems burned by accident?" Whimsy asked. Fanshawe gave a small, uncertain nod. He disliked sentiment. Preferred the cold ink of finality, but I can't imagine he'd destroy his own diary. He was a compulsive recorder. He once wrote 6 pages on the way a snail moved across the terrace. Then someone else did. Before Fanshawe could reply, a knock echoed at the front door. The butler entered shortly after, discreetly clearing his throat. "There's a Mr. Mervyn Calloway to see Miss Venn." Miss Venn's expression shifted. Surprise, then a tight wariness. She turned to Whimsy. "He's my fiancé." Whimsy arched an eyebrow. "How terribly romantic. Do bring him in. One always likes to meet a man who proposes before fire and murder." Moments later, Mr. Calloway entered. A tall, broad-shouldered man with the sort of jaw that newspapers find resolute and friends privately call obstinate. He bowed, not quite gracefully. "Ade," he said, with the forced calm of a man aware of too many witnesses. "I came because your letter worried me. What's this about fire?" Whimsy watched their exchange carefully, her guarded stance, his careful control. Something passed between them, unsaid but palpable. She gestured to Whimsy. "Lord Peter is investigating. Informally, there was a scream, and a fire, and a missing diary." Calloway nodded, slowly, That sounds like your kind of trouble. Whimsy intervened. My dear fellow, trouble is like port. It improves in good company. Did you know the poet Marchbanks? Only by reputation. Addie spoke of him often. She admired his early work. Whimsy's eyes twinkled. And the late work? I didn't read it. Then you may be in luck, Whimsy said, because someone made certain you never could. They left Calloway with Mrs. Marchbanks, who immediately began a cold interrogation disguised as polite enquiry, and returned to the hall. Whimsy drew Adelaide Venn aside. Your fiancé, what did you mean? It's his sort of trouble. She paused. He has history, an incident at university. He was once accused of plagiarism, claimed it was a setup. It nearly ended his degree. Whimsy looked thoughtful. So he's familiar with theft and literary resentment, and perhaps even with erasing things that shouldn't be read. She looked startled. You think he... I don't think, I ask. I listen. I noticed that when your fiancé stepped in, the smell of smoke grew stronger. His coat, Miss Venn, smells faintly of burnt fabric. Did he say where he was the night before last? Her lips parted, then closed again. No, she said quietly. He didn't. Whimsy smiled faintly. Then let's ask him, and perhaps ask the gardener too, whether anyone walked on the terrace that night. It's always the mud that remembers, Miss Venn. Always the mud. Lord Peter Whimsy's gaze lingered a moment longer on Miss Adelaide Venn's troubled face before he turned toward the window again. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows over the grounds of Willowdene Hall. The scent of faint smoke still hovered in the air, an invisible tether binding the room to the mystery at its heart. Miss Venn, Whimsy began, I believe our next course of action must involve the gardener you mentioned. Someone who tends the grounds often notices what the eyes of the household overlook: footprints in the soil, broken branches, signs of a visitor who should not be. She nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. His name is Samuel, a quiet man, rarely speaks, but he's been here for over 20 years. Loyal, if a bit superstitious. Perfect, Whimsy said, smiling at the prospect. Loyalty and superstition often make a reliable informant, one who may speak of secrets otherwise kept hidden. They made their way toward the back entrance, the heavy wooden door groaning under the touch of the butler's hand as it swung open to admit them into the crisp air. The garden was a study in English charm and calculated disorder. Roses clawed their way up trellises, while neat hedgerows framed the clipped lawns, all underlaid by the earthy aroma of damp earth and moss. A man was crouched near the rose bushes, his hands busy pruning with practiced care. He was of middling height, his face weathered and lined, and his eyes sharp beneath a furrowed brow. He looked up as Whimsy and Adelaide approached. Samuel, I trust you remember me, Whimsy said smoothly, extending a hand. The gardener wiped his hands on his trousers before shaking it. Lord Peter Whimsy. Yes, sir, I remember. I understand you might help us with a small inquiry, Whimsy said, careful to keep his tone light but edged with authority. Have you noticed anything unusual in the garden or near the east wing in the last few days? Samuel's eyes narrowed. Unusual, sir. Well, it's been quieter than usual, if you ask me. The east wing has always had a strange feeling. Folks say it's unlucky. I'd say it's been a bit too still since the fire. Whimsy pressed gently. Did you see anyone out of place on the terrace the night before last? The gardener hesitated, then nodded. I thought I might be mistaken, but I saw a figure near the east window, just about the time Miss Venn says she heard the scream. The light was low, but the person looked like a man, tall, moving slow. Did you see where he went? Adelaide asked, stepping forward. Samuel shook his head. No, ma'am. The shadow melted into the bushes when I called out. I didn't catch his face. But it was too late for a gardener's rounds. Whimsy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. A tall man, Near the scene, around the time of the scream and fire. Interesting. Was that all? Adelaide asked, the worry deepening in her voice. No, sir, Samuel said. I also noticed the scent of smoke lingering near the hedgerow this morning, strange as it may be. Smelled different from the hearth. Fires. Something sharper, like burning oil or rubber. Might be nothing, but I thought it worth mentioning. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Not nothing. You're a man of good observation, Samuel. You might be more helpful than you know. They thanked the gardener and made their way back inside, the house seeming quieter now, as if holding its breath in anticipation. Back in the drawing room, Whimsy settled into an armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Miss Venn, your fiancé, Mr. Calloway, has so far given us more questions than answers. We know he did not offer an alibi for the night in question, and his coat smells faintly of burnt fabric. That alone demands scrutiny. Adelaide nodded but said nothing. Tell me, Whimsy continued, what was the nature of his relationship with the Marchbanks family? Was he well received? Distant, she replied, and often tense. Mr. Calloway's family has no love for the Marchbanks. They consider them old-fashioned and pretentious. Calloway himself is proud and hot-tempered, which hasn't helped matters. And the plagiarism accusation? Whimsy asked, leaning forward. A university scandal from some years ago. He claimed it was a set-up but never proved it. The affair ended his chances at a scholarship and stained his reputation. Whimsy's eyes twinkled with a sudden thought. One can hardly imagine a man with such a grievance would refrain from an act of quiet revenge, especially if the victim were a poet whose diaries contained secrets capable of destroying him. Adelaide's breath caught. You think Calloway might have wanted the diary destroyed? It would be a natural inference, Whimsy agreed, but motive alone is not enough. We must find proof. Just then, the butler entered with a letter, sealed with the Marchbanks family crest. For Lord Peter, he said quietly. Whimsy broke the seal and unfolded the heavy paper inside. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried. Dear Lord Whimsy, it read, if you are to discover the truth about my late husband's diary, look not to those who dwell within these walls, but beyond. A certain solicitor, Mr. Percival Graves, who handled Mr. Marchbanks' estate, may hold the key you seek. Be cautious, for the past can be a dangerous place to wander. H.M. The signature was terse. Honoria Marchbanks. Whimsy folded the letter carefully. Honoria has been more forthcoming than I expected. She directs us to a solicitor outside Willowdene. Adelaide's eyes widened. Percival Graves. He visited here only last week and seemed quite eager to avoid mention of the diary. Exactly the sort of man one must interview, Whimsy said, rising. If the diary was destroyed to conceal a scandal, then the solicitor who managed the estate might have had the means or the motive to intervene. Before leaving, Whimsy paused and turned to Adelaide. You mentioned Mrs. Marchbanks mutters Latin when alone. Did you ever catch what she says? Adelaide considered. Only fragments. Silentium est veritas. Silence is truth. And sometimes fiat voluntas tua. Let your will be done. She repeats them like a prayer or a curse. Whimsy nodded gravely. Words to live and die by. We'll need to remember those. The motor car was ready and waiting. As they drove toward the nearby town where Mr. Graves had his offices, Whimsy glanced at Adelaide. Tell me, Miss Venn, have you noticed anyone else acting strangely? Servants, family friends, neighbors? She hesitated, then said softly, There is Mrs. Emmeline Crowther, the housekeeper's sister. She arrived suddenly a few days ago and has taken an unusual interest in the study and its papers. Whimsy's smile was sardonic. An interloper under the guise of kinship. I trust we shall pay her a visit soon enough. The solicitor's office was a small, sombre building set between a tobacconist and a draper's shop. The bell tinkled as Whimsy pushed the door open, and they were met by a man in his late 50s with sharp eyes, behind gold-rimmed spectacles and an impeccably trimmed beard. "Lord Peter Whimsy," he said smoothly. "I've heard you have questions about the late Mr. Marchbank's affairs." "Yes, Mr. Graves," Whimsy said, "particularly concerning his diaries and the unfortunate fire at Willowdene." The solicitor's smile was thin. "A regrettable event, but all personal effects have been accounted for, as far as I know." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "All except the 1911 diary, apparently." Graves' hand twitched slightly. "That diary was believed lost many years ago. It was of no legal significance and was not included in the estate papers." "Yet Mrs. Marchbanks seems concerned about its absence," Whimsy pressed. The solicitor's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Marchbanks is a lady prone to melancholia. I suggest you do not read too much into her worries." "On the contrary," Whimsy said, "it is precisely those worries that ignite curiosity." Graves folded his hands. "I am at your disposal for any further inquiries, Lord Whimsy, but I assure you, my dealings have been entirely above board." Whimsy inclined his head, but inside he felt the first true thread of suspicion begin to unravel. As they left the office, Adelaide whispered, "He seems nervous." "A well-trained actor," Whimsy said softly. "Let us hope his performance falters before this investigation ends." The afternoon waned as they returned to Willowdene, shadows lengthening across the gravel drives. Lord Peter was quiet, gathering thoughts. "We have a fire set with deliberation, a missing diary tied to a silent scandal, a fiancé with secrets, and a solicitor who's evasive. The stage is set for truth to be uncovered, Miss Venn." She looked at him, hope mingled with fear. "Do you think we'll find the real story before someone else tries to rewrite it?" Whimsy smiled gently. "In these matters, the truth has a way of revealing itself, though often it comes cloaked in smoke and whispers. We must be ready for both." The house seemed to lean closer as twilight fell, eager to share its secrets to those bold enough to ask. The evening settled over Willowdene Hall with an uneasy stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath, awaiting some revelation. Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the mullioned window of the drawing-room, gazing thoughtfully at the flickering gaslights below. The last traces of sunlight had vanished, leaving only the deepening shadows that seemed to gather like conspirators in the corners. Miss Adelaide Venn had excused herself some time ago, retreating to her chambers under the pretense of rest. Yet Whimsy suspected the weight of the day's discoveries pressed heavily upon her. The subtle tremor in her voice when speaking of her fiancé's past was not easily forgotten. The servant who had delivered tea announced that Mrs. Emmeline Crowther awaited in the library. A brisk knock, then the door opened to reveal a woman whose appearance seemed as deliberately arranged as a theatrical costume. Mrs. Crowther's tightly pulled back hair, dark dress of severe cut, and sharp, penetrating eyes gave her the air of a matron versed in discipline and secrets alike. "Mrs. Crowther," Whimsy said with polite hauteur, "you are an unexpected guest, though I understand your fondness for Willowdene extends beyond mere familial ties." She smiled thinly, eyes flicking briefly toward the door as if ensuring no eavesdroppers lurked beyond. "Indeed, Lord Whimsy. My sister, the housekeeper, has long served this estate, but I confess my interest is rather more academic. I find the recent events distressing, and as one who has devoted herself to the study of antiquities and manuscripts, I felt compelled to offer my assistance." Whimsy inclined his head. "An intriguing avocation. Perhaps you can shed light on the matter of the missing diary, which appears to hold more significance than mere sentimental value." Mrs. Crowther's smile did not reach her eyes. "There is much in old papers that the living would prefer remain buried. Diaries, letters, and manuscripts often serve as instruments of power, tools to be wielded or destroyed in equal measure." "Quite," Whimsy mused. "Might I ask if you have had occasion to examine the study since the fire?" "I have," she said crisply. "Though I confess the charred remains offer scant clues, my interest lies in what was removed or hidden beforehand." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Whimsy allowed a moment before replying. "Do you suspect that some item of importance was taken prior to the fire?" Mrs. Crowther's gaze sharpened. It would be foolish not to consider the possibility. Fires conveniently erase evidence, but the absence of the 1911 diary, already reported missing, suggests prior removal. "And do you know who might have had access to the study on the day of the fire?" "Only those within the household, I imagine," she said, "though some guests have been more curious than polite." Whimsy noted the hint of disdain in her voice and filed it away for future reflection. "Thank you, Mrs. Crowther. Your insights are valuable." After she departed, Whimsy paced slowly, turning over the facts in his mind. The solicitor's evasiveness, the gardener's shadowy figure, the absent diary, and now Mrs. Crowther's suggestion of premeditated concealment. Each thread was distinct, yet woven tightly into a fabric of concealment. As the grandfather clock chimed the hour, a soft rap on the door announced the arrival of Inspector Charles Parker. He entered with the brisk efficiency characteristic of his station, yet his eyes held a grudging respect for Whimsy. "Evening, Lord Peter. Miss Venn seems less anxious now." "Her spirit is still fragile, Inspector," Whimsy replied, "but I trust she gains strength with each discovery." Parker nodded, folding his arms. "I've spoken with the staff again. No one admits to seeing anything suspicious, but several report hearing a woman crying late into the night." "Crying?" Whimsy echoed. "Yes, a broken, almost strangled sound. No one ventured outside to investigate. Fear, I suppose." "A pity," Whimsy said, "for tears can often reveal more than words." They moved toward the library, where a faint glow came from a single oil lamp. Whimsy gestured toward a heavy, leather-bound ledger lying open on a side table. "I asked for a copy of the visitor logs," Parker explained. "You'll find them rather prosaic, but I noticed an irregularity." Whimsy leaned forward to scan the pages. The entries were neat, dated, and signed. Most visitors were family friends or business associates, but on the evening of the fire, an entry stood out. A Miss Cecily Hart, signed at 7:15 p.m., though no one had previously mentioned her presence. "Who is Miss Hart?" Whimsy inquired. Parker scratched his chin. "A distant cousin of the Marchbanks. Not well known, keeps mostly to herself. According to the maids, she arrived unannounced and left abruptly after a short time." "Curious," Whimsy murmured. "A visitor not accounted for, arriving shortly before the fire. We must find her." As if summoned by their discussion, a light knock preceded the entrance of Adelaide Venn. She looked pale, but determined. "I found something in the nursery," she said breathlessly. "A fragment of burnt paper behind the dresser. It seems part of a letter, though most is illegible. But these words are clear. The truth must remain buried." Whimsy took the scrap gently, examining the jagged edges. The phrase echoed Mrs. Crowther's warning about secrets better left hidden. "This confirms the deliberate nature of the destruction," Whimsy said. "The diary was no mere record. It was a weapon or a shield." They discussed their next move. Locating Miss Hart was paramount. Parker promised to send officers to the nearest lodgings and inquire discreetly. While waiting for news, Whimsy requested access once more to the scene of the fire. The east wing remained cordoned, but the housekeeper had allowed a brief inspection of the study's outer corridor. Whimsy's eyes swept the walls and floor with the detective's precision. A faint trace of powder lingered near the doorframe, perhaps an accelerant. He spotted a small, nearly invisible scratch on the brass handle, suggesting a hurried, forced entry. He crouched and examined the dust, noting two sets of footprints, one unmistakably large and booted, the other smaller, more delicate. "So, we have two visitors in the corridor, one large, one small," Whimsy mused aloud. Miss Venn's tall man, and now, perhaps, Miss Hart. Their presence at such a critical time was no coincidence. Returning to the drawing-room, Whimsy sat with fingers steepled, his mind racing through the permutations. The psychological elements were now paramount: jealousy, fear, secrets. Each figure within the household or beyond had their own stake in what was concealed. Adelaide's voice broke the silence. "Lord Peter, do you think my fiancé could be involved?" Whimsy regarded her kindly. "Miss Venn, while Mr. Calloway's history is checkered, we must not allow personal biases to cloud judgment. The truth is often stranger than any personal vendetta." Her eyes filled with tears she did not shed. "Tomorrow we must speak with Miss Hart, and I wish to revisit Mr. Percival Graves' offices. I suspect the solicitor is not merely evasive, but hiding something more pernicious." The night deepened. Outside, an owl hooted, a solitary sentinel over secrets long buried. Inside Willowdene, the flickering flames in the hearth cast shadows that whispered of betrayals and broken promises. Lord Peter Whimsy rose, preparing for the next day's inquiries. "One must always remember," he said to himself, "that in the labyrinth of human folly it is often the smallest clue, the whispered word or misplaced token, that leads to revelation." With that, he lit his pipe, the soft glow of the ember illuminating his features as he sank into thought, poised on the brink of uncovering the dark heart of Willowdene. The dawn broke pale and uncertain over the quiet village where Miss Cecily Hart was said to have lodged, a modest boarding house nestled among the narrow streets like a secret whispered behind shuttered windows. Lord Peter Whimsy and Inspector Parker arrived shortly after breakfast, the morning mist still curling along the cobblestones, lending an ephemeral quality to the scene that felt fitting for their pursuit of shadows. The proprietor of the boarding house, a stout woman with sharp eyes and a guarded manner, greeted them with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Hart checked in late on the evening of the 22nd, she confirmed after some hesitation. "Stayed one night, then left early the next morning without paying, which was quite unusual. Left behind only a small satchel and a note." Whimsy's brow furrowed. "A note, you say? May we see it?" The woman retrieved a folded slip of paper from behind the counter and handed it over. Whimsy unfolded the note carefully. The handwriting was hurried and uneven. "I must leave before noon. Trust no one. The past is not what it seems. C.H." Inspector Parker exchanged a glance with Whimsy. Cryptic, to say the least. "Indeed," Whimsy murmured. Miss Hart clearly felt herself in danger or under pressure. "We must learn why." They pressed the proprietor for more details. The boarding house staff had seen little of Miss Hart during her brief stay, but one maid recalled a visitor who came late at night, a man, tall and clad in dark clothing, who waited for her in the shadows near the back alley. The maid's voice dropped to a whisper. He seemed urgent. They spoke in low tones, and Miss Hart appeared frightened. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "This man may be the tall figure Samuel the gardener described, a key piece in our puzzle." With scant leads, they left the boarding house to seek out any acquaintances of Miss Hart in the village. Their inquiries revealed little. Miss Hart was something of an enigma, a woman who kept to herself, known to read extensively and frequent the local library. Some mentioned her as having a sharp temper and a penchant for secrecy, but no one could say why she had come to Willowdene or what she hoped to find. Back at Willowdene Hall, the atmosphere had grown tense with the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Adelaide Venn had taken refuge in the small chapel on the grounds, seeking solace in prayer and reflection. Whimsy found her there, kneeling amid the flickering candlelight, her face pale but resolute. "Miss Venn," Whimsy said gently, taking a seat beside her, "I understand this ordeal weighs heavily upon you." She glanced up, eyes glistening. It is as if the walls themselves hold secrets too dark to bear. "There is much we do not yet understand, but the truth will emerge, It often does in time. She nodded, drawing strength from his calm assurance. I wish I could be more help, but I fear I have only deepened the mystery. On the contrary, Whimsy said, your courage in sharing what you have is the beacon guiding us through this fog. They returned to the drawing room where the solicitor's letter had been placed carefully on the table. Whimsy's thoughts turned again to Percival Graves, whose evasiveness still rang alarm bells. Inspector Parker, Whimsy began, I propose we revisit Mr. Graves' offices, this time with a more focused inquiry into the financial records surrounding the Marchbanks estate. Agreed, Parker said. I've spoken with some contacts at the local bank, and there may be irregularities worth pursuing. The morning waned as Whimsy and Parker pored over ledgers and correspondence supplied by the solicitor's clerks. Among the mundane entries, Whimsy's keen eyes spotted something curious. A series of large withdrawals from the Marchbanks Trust Fund shortly before the fire, signed off by Percival Graves himself. Odd timing, Whimsy remarked. These withdrawals ceased abruptly after the fire. Parker's voice dropped. Could it be an attempt to cover debts or conceal assets? Perhaps. But why risk drawing attention so near to such a disastrous event? It suggests desperation or panic. Whimsy's fingers traced the inked signatures thoughtfully. And why keep such withdrawals secret from the family? They sought out the family lawyer to question him on the matter, but he declined to speak without Graves present. It was clear the solicitor had significant influence and perhaps leverage over those involved. Returning to Willowdene, Whimsy's mind turned once more to the fragment of burnt paper Adelaide had found. The words, "The truth must remain buried," echoed ominously. Such a phrase could only mean one thing. Someone feared exposure and had gone to great lengths to prevent it. Late that afternoon, as the light began to fade, a knock at the door announced a visitor. Mrs. Emmeline Crowther, her presence as sudden as the mysteries unfolding around them. "I've been thinking," she said, stepping inside with a purposeful stride. "And there is one matter that has not been fully addressed, the diaries themselves. I know more than you might imagine about old manuscripts, their value not only monetary, but political and personal." Whimsy regarded her with interest. "Please, elaborate." She drew a folded sheet from her pocket and spread it on the table. It was a reproduction of a letter penned by the late Mr. Marchbanks, addressed to an unknown correspondent and referencing a certain document of great consequence hidden away. "Could this be the diary?" Whimsy asked. "Very possibly," Mrs. Crowther answered. "Mr. Marchbanks was involved in affairs beyond his poetry, financial dealings, political secrets that could ruin reputations if made public." Whimsy's mind raced. The diary, then, was not just a personal journal, but a ledger of dangerous knowledge. Its destruction would protect many and incriminate others. But why target Miss Venn and her fiancé? What threat do they pose? Mrs. Crowther's eyes glinted. Because they are the only ones with a claim to the estate and the knowledge that such a document exists. If the diary were found, it could unravel carefully laid plans. The room grew colder, the weight of unspoken threats pressing down on them. Whimsy stood and paced. "We must act swiftly. Locate Miss Hart, uncover the full extent of Mr. Graves' dealings, and protect those endangered by these secrets." As evening deepened, the household gathered for dinner under a strained silence. Adelaide sat quietly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her, Mr. Calloway watched with a guarded expression, shadows playing across his face. Whimsy caught the furtive glance the young man cast toward the library door before looking away. After the meal, Whimsy requested to speak with Mr. Calloway alone. They retired to the study, its walls lined with books blackened by smoke but still standing sentinel. "Mr. Calloway," Whimsy began gently, "your reluctance to explain your whereabouts on the night of the fire remains troubling. I ask you now for honesty, no matter how difficult." Calloway's jaw tightened, but after a long pause, he nodded. I was near the east wing, yes, but not to set fire or harm anyone. Then what brought you there? A confrontation, Calloway admitted, voice low. I met Miss Hart by chance, or perhaps fate. She told me things about the diary, the solicitor, and the dangers it posed. Go on. She warned me to keep away, that people I trusted might not be what they seemed. I wanted to protect Adelaide, but I was out of my depth. Whimsy leaned forward. Did you see anyone else there? Calloway hesitated. Yes, a man. Tall, dark, and cold. He threatened me and said the diary must never be found. Did you recognize him? No, but his voice, I will never forget it. Whimsy's mind connected the dots. The tall man, Samuel's sighting, the mysterious visitor to Miss Hart, the missing diary, and Graves' questionable behavior. The pieces were closing in. As the night deepened, Whimsy stood at the window once more, looking out into the darkness that cloaked Willowdene. Somewhere in that shadow lay the key to the mystery, a truth buried beneath fear and fire, waiting to be uncovered. The fragile peace of the night was shattered by a sudden, urgent knock at the study door. Whimsy, still seated by the window, rose immediately. It was Inspector Parker, his face taut with concern and eyes sharp as ever. Lord Peter, we have news about Miss Cecily Hart. Whimsy gestured for him to enter. Speak, Inspector. She's been found, disguised in a nearby town, attempting to leave on the early morning train. Her luggage contained several letters and a worn, leather-bound notebook, presumably the diary we've been seeking. Parker paused, then added, She claims she feared for her life and sought to keep the diary safe. Whimsy's mind raced, the intricate puzzle beginning to sharpen into focus. Fetch her here at once. We must hear her story. While Parker went to arrange for Miss Hart's transport, Whimsy reflected on the day's revelations. Each thread, Percival Graves' suspicious transactions, the tall shadow haunting the corridors, Calloway's confession, and now Hart's desperate flight, wove together into a tapestry of treachery and fear. Adelaide entered quietly, her expression etched with worry. Is there hope, Lord Peter? There is always hope, Miss Venn, though it often comes cloaked in hardship, Whimsy replied gently. Miss Hart's testimony may illuminate the dark corners we've yet to explore. The door opened to reveal Miss Hart herself, a woman of uncertain age, with sharp, intelligent eyes that betrayed the fatigue of flight and fear. She carried herself with a nervous grace, as if every word might draw unseen eyes upon her. Miss Hart, Whimsy began, you are safe here. Please tell us everything you know about the diary and the events leading to the fire. She swallowed hard, then began. I came to Willowdene because of the diary. It contains not just personal musings, but evidence, proof of deceit and corruption within the family and among those close to the estate. Proof of what, exactly? Whimsy urged, her voice lowered to a whisper. Fraud, manipulation of wills, hidden debts, and threats against those who dared question the solicitor, Mr. Graves. The diary was my father's, and he warned me to protect it at all costs. Whimsy exchanged a glance with Parker. Your father? Yes. He was the Marchbanks lawyer before Graves took over. When he uncovered irregularities, he began keeping a record, a diary of everything. Then he disappeared under suspicious circumstances. I inherited the diary and the danger it brought. Do you know who threatened your father? Whimsy asked. Not directly, but I suspect Graves and those loyal to him. He wielded power quietly but ruthlessly. Did your father confide in anyone else? Adelaide asked gently. No, she replied. He feared betrayal even within the family. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. And on the night of the fire, I came to Willowdene to confront Graves and retrieve the diary before it could be destroyed. But I was followed, and when I met Mr. Calloway, I hoped to find an ally. Instead, the fire broke out, and chaos ensued. Who was the tall man who threatened you? Parker pressed. I never saw his face clearly, only his voice. He warned me that the diary must be lost, that the truth would ruin lives. Whimsy's gaze hardened. We must find this man. Suddenly, a sharp knock interrupted their conversation. The housekeeper entered, her face pale. Lord Peter, the gardener has found something near the east wing, an object buried beneath the ashes. Whimsy rose swiftly and followed her outside into the chilling night air. Near the charred remains of the study, the gardener unearthed a small, scorched box. Whimsy examined it carefully. It bore the Marchbanks family crest, partially blackened but intact. Inside were several papers, fragments of diary entries, receipts, and a faded photograph of a man resembling Percival Graves. Evidence at last, Whimsy murmured, carefully gathering the documents. This may hold the key to the final confrontation. Back inside, as the household gathered uneasily, Whimsy laid out the recovered papers. The entries detailed secret financial transactions and coercive threats linked directly to Graves, painting a grim portrait of manipulation and greed. It appears Mr. Graves sought to control the estate through fear and forgery, Whimsy declared. His embezzlement and intimidation were threatened by the diary's revelations. Adelaide's voice trembled. But what can we do now? He is still free and dangerous. We must act quickly, Whimsy said. Inspector Parker, have the solicitor brought in for questioning. Miss Hart and Mr. Calloway will provide testimony. The truth will out. As the household braced for the confrontation, Whimsy took a moment to speak privately with Adelaide. You must remain strong. The path to justice is never without peril, but with courage, light can pierce even the darkest shadows. She nodded, steeling herself. The hours passed, and soon the sound of footsteps heralded the arrival of Percival Graves, accompanied by a silent barrister. His face was a mask of composed arrogance, but beneath the calm, Whimsy sensed a man cornered. Mr. Graves, Whimsy began, we have reason to believe you orchestrated the fire to destroy evidence of your crimes. Graves smiled thinly. Accusations without proof are mere slander. Yet here are the diary fragments, your signature on forged documents, and witnesses placing you near the scene at critical moments. The solicitor's facade cracked briefly, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Miss Hart, would you please recount your encounter with Mr. Graves? She stepped forward, steady despite her ordeal. He threatened me, demanded the diary, and warned that exposing him would destroy me. Calloway nodded in agreement. I heard his voice too. I saw him lurking near the study shortly before the fire. Parker moved forward. Mr. Graves, you are under arrest for arson, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. As officers led the solicitor away, a heavy tension lifted from Willowdene Hall. The long night of secrets was beginning to yield to dawn's first light. Whimsy turned to Adelaide and Miss Hart. Though the battle is not yet fully won, the truth is now in the open. Justice will follow. Outside, the sun rose, scattering shadows across the estate. The fire's scars would remain, but so too would the courage of those who dared to seek the truth hidden within Willowdene's walls. The morning light filtered softly through the stained-glass windows of the library, casting kaleidoscopic patterns across the shelves, still scarred by soot and flame. Lord Peter Whimsy stood near the hearth, the weight of recent revelations pressing heavily upon him. Though Percival Graves was now in custody, the tangled web of deceit and danger that had enveloped Willowdene was far from fully unraveled. Adelaide Venn sat quietly in a high-backed chair, her fingers tracing the rim of a delicate teacup. Her pale eyes reflected both fatigue and an emerging resolve. Miss Cecily Hart, seated across from her, held the leather-bound diary carefully in her lap, its worn pages now a fragile testament to hidden truths. Inspector Parker was consulting his notebook, marking the details of their ongoing inquiry. The solicitor's arrest has rattled many, but we must anticipate retaliation or attempts to cover further tracks. There's no telling who else might be implicated. Whimsy nodded, his gaze shifting toward the cracked mantelpiece. Graves was but one actor in this drama. The diary hints at deeper conspiracies, alliances formed in shadows, and secrets too dangerous to expose. He approached the diary, turning its brittle pages with the reverence due a relic. Among the hastily penned entries were references to an unnamed partner, a Mr. Blackwood, involved in manipulating estate affairs behind the scenes. A particular passage caught Whimsy's eye. Blackwood's greed knows no bounds. He threatens those who come close. The diary must remain hidden, lest all be lost. Blackwood, Whimsy mused aloud. A shadow in the wings, invisible yet deadly. Adelaide's voice broke the silence. I've heard whispers of a distant relative, an elusive figure connected through marriage, rarely seen but often spoken of with unease. Could this be him? It is likely, Whimsy agreed. We must uncover his identity and whereabouts before he acts. Parker interjected, I've already dispatched inquiries to the local registries and legal offices. Blackwood's name appears sporadically in property transactions, but there's little on his current location. As they pondered their next steps, a soft knock came at the door. The housekeeper entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. This was left at the gate earlier today, sir. No sender's name. Whimsy took the parcel carefully, feeling its weight and the faint hint of dampness. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a folded, typewritten letter and a small silver locket. The letter's content was chilling. You tread on dangerous ground. Cease your investigation or face consequences. Blackwood watches. The locket was engraved with an unfamiliar crest, a raven perched atop a skull, the symbol of a secretive lineage known only to a few. Adelaide's hand trembled as Whimsy passed the locket to her. This belonged to my grandmother, she whispered. She spoke once of a family feud and a legacy of bitterness that followed the Blackwoods. The room seemed to contract with the weight of unspoken histories. The mystery was no longer merely about a fire or a forged will. It was entwined with bloodlines, grudges, and the ghosts of the past. Whimsy resolved to speak with the village historian, an elderly man reputed to know the intricate genealogies of the local families. Perhaps he could shed light on the Blackwood lineage and their ties to Marchbanks. Later that afternoon, Whimsy and Parker set out to visit the historian's home, a cluttered cottage filled with dusty tomes and faded portraits. The old man, Mr. Emsley, received them with wary hospitality. Ah, Lord Peter, he greeted, adjusting his spectacles. The Marchbanks tale is a tangled one indeed. Whimsy presented the locket. Can you tell us more about this symbol and its significance? Emsley's eyes widened slightly. The raven and skull, emblems of the Blackwood house, a cadet branch long estranged from the main Marchbanks line. They were known for their ruthless pursuit of power and wealth, often through clandestine means. He leaned forward. Blackwood himself was last known to reside in a remote estate across the moors, Langley Hall. But the place has been abandoned for years. Locals say strange lights and noises come from there at night. Superstitions, of course, but such tales often contain kernels of truth. Whimsy's curiosity was piqued. Could Blackwood be operating from there still, hidden from the world? Possible, Emsley replied gravely. And dangerous. As they left the cottage, the setting sun painted the sky in streaks of blood red and gold. The moors stretched before them like an endless ocean of shadow and mist. Back at Willowdene, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. Adelaide and Miss Hart exchanged anxious glances, both aware that the threat looming over them was far from neutralized. Whimsy shared his findings with them and Parker, formulating a plan. We must investigate Langley Hall. If Blackwood is indeed the mastermind behind the threats and the attempt to suppress the diary, confronting him is our only hope. Parker nodded. We should prepare carefully. It may be a trap. That night, as the household settled under uneasy silence, a faint scratching sound came from the direction of the charred study. Whimsy rose to investigate, followed discreetly by Parker. Near the ruined hearth, a small scrap of paper fluttered to the floor, an ominous warning scrawled in hastily printed letters. "The past is a blade. Handle with care." The chilling message reinforced the urgency of their quest. As dawn approached, Whimsy, Parker, Adelaide, and Miss Hart gathered provisions and weapons, readying themselves for the journey across the moors. The air was crisp, biting with the promise of rain. Each step away from the safety of Willowdene was a step deeper into uncertainty. Crossing the wild expanse, the four companions moved with care, shadows lengthening as dark clouds gathered. Approaching the silhouette of Langley Hall, its decaying turrets rose like a skeletal hand grasping at the sky. The heavy front door creaked open with an eerie welcome as Whimsy pushed against it. Inside, the musty scent of neglect and faded grandeur enveloped them. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, illuminating peeling wallpaper and shattered glass. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a whispered threat. They moved cautiously through the cavernous halls until a faint glow drew them toward a distant room. There, seated before a flickering fire, was a tall figure cloaked in black, his face obscured by shadows. The air thickened with tension. "Lord Peter Whimsy," the figure intoned, voice cold and unyielding. "I wondered when you would arrive." Whimsy stepped forward, steady and composed. "Mr. Blackwood, your machinations have caused much harm. It ends tonight." The man laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "You chase ghosts and secrets, but you have no idea what forces you meddle with." Adelaide stepped beside Whimsy, voice firm. "The truth is no ghost. It is a light that will expose your darkness." Blackwood's eyes glittered dangerously. "Then prepare yourselves. This night will test your resolve." The room seemed to close around them, shadows dancing as the confrontation, the final reckoning, was about to begin. The flickering fire cast long, grotesque shadows on the peeling walls of Langley Hall's great chamber, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and smoke. Blackwood's voice, low and menacing, still echoed faintly as Whimsy, Adelaide, Parker, and Cecily Hart stood their ground, the tension a palpable thread binding them. "Prepare yourselves," Blackwood had said, and yet none moved to strike. Instead, Whimsy regarded the man with a measured calm, the steady confidence of a man who had unraveled many mysteries and faced far darker dangers. "You've threatened many, Mr. Blackwood," Whimsy began, voice steady, "but your time manipulating shadows is over. We know of your schemes. The forged documents, the intimidation, the fire meant to silence the truth." Blackwood's eyes narrowed, the faintest smile curling at the corners of his lips. "You underestimate the depths of what you do not see. I am but a servant of a greater design." Adelaide shifted uneasily. "Greater design? What could possibly justify the ruin you've wrought?" "A legacy," Blackwood answered darkly. "The Marchbank's name is a throne to be seized, and I will not have it fall into unworthy hands." Parker stepped forward, his voice authoritative. "Your threats, your arson, your fraud, they end tonight. You're under arrest." Blackwood laughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to stir the dust in the stale air. "Arrest? You mistake desperation for authority, Inspector." At that moment, a sudden creaking from the far end of the room drew all eyes. From the shadows emerged two figures, silhouettes against the dim glow, their presence unexpected and fraught with silent menace. Whimsy's gaze sharpened instantly. "More of your accomplices?" One of the figures stepped forward into the firelight. A woman, tall and composed, her eyes glinting with cold resolve. "Blackwood is not the only player in this game," she said crisply. "We've come to ensure the truth stays buried." Cecily Hart's fingers tightened around the diary. "You won't succeed. This estate holds secrets that must be told." The woman's lips curved into a cruel smile. Secrets can be bought, stolen, or destroyed. Whimsy weighed his options quickly. The room, though large, now contained 4 adversaries whose combined intentions were clear: to keep the diary and its revelations hidden at any cost. "Inspector," Whimsy whispered, "we need to act swiftly before they close ranks." Parker's hand moved toward his holster, but Whimsy held up a calming hand. "Not yet. If we provoke them too soon, the diary and those who protect it could be lost." Blackwood spoke again, voice edged with impatience. "You waste time, Whimsy. The diary contains lies, fabrications designed to ruin reputations and destabilize the family. I will not allow that." "Lies?" Whimsy countered. "We have the documents, the testimonies. Your schemes are laid bare." The woman moved closer, drawing a small pistol from beneath her coat. The flash of steel made hearts pound. "Enough talk." But before the situation could erupt into violence, a sudden noise from the doorway startled everyone. A group of constables, led by additional officers Parker had summoned, burst into the chamber, their weapons drawn and commands sharp. "Freeze!" one shouted. Caught off guard, Blackwood and his companion hesitated. The sudden appearance of law enforcement fractured their confidence. Whimsy stepped forward. "This is the end of the line. Surrender peacefully, and justice will be served fairly." Blackwood's jaw tightened. After a tense moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. The woman, still wary, lowered her weapon reluctantly. As the officers moved to detain the two, Whimsy turned to Parker. "Search the premises thoroughly. There may be more hidden caches, evidence we have yet to uncover." The arrest was swift and controlled. The tension in the room eased, though an undercurrent of unease remained. The diary, the documents, the shadows of Langley Hall, all bore scars that would take time to heal. Outside, the first rain of the evening began to fall, pattering softly against the windows. Adelaide exhaled deeply, leaning against the heavy oak door. "It's over." "For now," Whimsy replied, his gaze distant. "But justice is a journey, not a destination. We have won a battle. The war for truth continues." Cecily Hart, clutching the diary, met his eyes with quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Lord Peter. Without you, the secrets would have perished in the flames." Whimsy inclined his head gently. "The truth, Miss Hart, has a way of enduring even the darkest attempts to bury it." As the group made their way back through the shadowed corridors, the weight of the night's events pressed upon them all. Yet beneath that weight lay a fragile hope that from the ashes of deceit, a new chapter for Willowdene might begin. Outside, the moor stretched into the mist, the rain cleansing the earth, and with it, the sins that had once threatened to consume the estate. The story was far from finished, but for the first time in many weeks, the dawn seemed to promise something brighter. The first blush of morning brought with it a brittle clarity to the damp air surrounding Langley Hall. The rain had ceased, leaving the moor slick and shimmering under the weak sun, as if the earth itself was washing away the residue of secrets long kept and sins deeply buried. Yet, for all its apparent cleansing, the atmosphere was heavy with the knowledge that justice, though begun, was far from complete. Lord Peter Whimsy stood on the threshold of the great hall, the weight of the previous night's confrontation pressing on his mind with a peculiar insistence. He had watched Blackwood and his enigmatic companion, a Miss Eleanor Strathmore, be taken into custody, their arrogance replaced by wary calculation. But the puzzle, as always, had layers yet to be peeled away. "Inspector," Whimsy murmured, his voice quiet but firm, "I'm inclined to believe that this was merely a single, if crucial, act in a far larger design." Blackwood was no solitary puppeteer. His reach extended farther than even we anticipated. Parker, standing nearby, nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, sir, our searches have uncovered several letters and documents hidden behind a false panel in the study, evidence of correspondence with influential figures beyond the estate. Connections we had no reason to suspect. Adelaide Venn, still pale but resolved, approached, clutching the silver locket from the previous evening. My grandmother's tales spoke of a cabal, a circle of the powerful who conspired to control Marchbanks and its fortunes. Could these documents be the key to their identities? Whimsy took the locket gently from her hand, the metal cool against his fingers. This symbol, the raven and skull, is not merely ornamental. It is an emblem of loyalty, a sign of shared allegiance among these shadowed players. We must tread carefully. As the morning progressed, the housekeeper delivered breakfast to the group assembled in the great hall, Whimsy, Parker, Adelaide, and Miss Hart, all aware that the hours ahead were critical. The solicitor's diary, now transcribed and carefully examined, revealed a meticulous account of fraud, intimidation, and manipulation, but it also hinted at deeper betrayals of trust and loyalty. The true nature of the cabal was emerging like a dark stain spreading through the pages. Whimsy's keen eyes lingered on a particular passage. The network extends beyond bloodlines. Contracts sealed in silence, enforced by fear. Our enemies will not rest until the Marchbank's name is ours in full. Enemies? Cecily Hart repeated softly. Not just family, then. Precisely, Whimsy said. And therein lies the danger. This is no mere dispute over inheritance. It is a struggle for power disguised as a familial quarrel. The afternoon brought the arrival of the local magistrate and a team of officers tasked with cataloguing the documents seized from Langley Hall. The atmosphere was one of solemn efficiency, but beneath it lay a tension barely contained. Whimsy retreated briefly to the library, poring over maps and genealogical charts, painstakingly assembled by Mr. Emsley. The interwoven relationships between Marchbanks, Blackwood, and other regional families revealed a complicated tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and vendettas. Every name carried weight, every marriage a potential motive. A sudden knock interrupted his concentration. It was Miss Hart, her expression grave. "Lord Peter, there's something you must see. The housekeeper found this tucked away in a drawer within Blackwood's desk." She handed him a folded letter, its edges worn but the ink fresh and sharp. Whimsy unfolded it carefully, reading the elegant handwriting. "Dearest Eleanor, the night of the fire must be our final gambit. Once the diary is destroyed, all doubts will vanish. Our enemies will be blind to the truth, and the path clear to secure our inheritance. Trust in the plan and in me. Yours, always, R." The letter chilled Whimsy to the bone, for the initial suggested culprit's signature, R, was unmistakable. The initial of a name mentioned only in whispers. Rupert Marchbanks, a distant cousin, long presumed benign, but now cast in a shadow, far darker. The mystery deepened. Rupert's motivations were more complex than simple greed. The letter suggested cold calculation, a willingness to burn everything to ash for power. Whimsy summoned Inspector Parker and Adelaide to confer. Rupert Marchbanks. His involvement changes everything. He was present at the estate during the fire, his alibi previously accepted without question. Parker frowned. We have yet to question him directly. Perhaps it is time. Plans were quickly made to visit Rupert Marchbanks, who lived in a modest estate not far from the village. The journey was tense, the car rolling over slick roads through woods still dripping with rain. Rupert received them in a study lined with books and hunting trophies, his demeanor calm and measured, a man accustomed to control. Yet, beneath his composed exterior, Whimsy detected a flicker of unease. "Lord Peter," Rupert greeted with a slight bow. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We have questions regarding your movements on the night of the fire," Whimsy said, his tone polite but unyielding. Rupert's eyes sharpened. "I have already provided an alibi to Inspector Parker. I was at the village inn drinking with acquaintances." "Curious," Whimsy said, "because we have reason to believe you had a hand in orchestrating the fire to cover up the destruction of certain documents." Rupert smiled thinly. "An accusation most serious, sir. You'll find no proof, I assure you." Whimsy exchanged a glance with Parker. "Proof is often hidden in plain sight, Mr. Marchbanks. We intend to find it." As the questioning continued, Rupert's defenses grew brittle. He faltered when asked about his relationship with Blackwood and Eleanor Strathmore, denying knowledge but unable to dismiss their shared history. The threads of conspiracy began to tighten around him. Leaving Rupert's estate, Whimsy pondered the tangled motives. The fire was a distraction, a violent attempt to bury the past, but the past refuses to remain silent. Back at Willowdene, the interrogation of Rupert Marchbanks was arranged for the following day, and Whimsy resolved to revisit the charred study, seeking clues overlooked in the initial sweep. In the smoky residue of the hearth, Whimsy's eyes caught a faint outline, a scorch mark oddly shaped, as if a hidden latch had been recently forced open. Investigating further, he discovered a concealed compartment beneath a loose floorboard. Inside lay a bundle of letters and a small leather-bound notebook. The letters revealed collusion, plans between Rupert, Blackwood, and Strathmore to manipulate wills, intimidate rivals, and ensure the Marchbanks estate would fall entirely under their control. The notebook contained coded references to payments made to local officials and vague threats toward those who might interfere. Whimsy's smile was thin but triumphant. The evidence was irrefutable. Later, during the questioning of Rupert, the new findings were presented. Confronted with the proof, Rupert's composure shattered, and under pressure, he confessed to his role in the conspiracy, the arson, the threats, and the elaborate deception designed to usurp the rightful heirs. But even as he admitted guilt, Rupert's final words held a bitter irony. "You may have won this battle, Lord Peter, but power is not so easily relinquished. The shadows will always lengthen." Whimsy regarded him quietly. "Perhaps. But for tonight, justice has found its mark." As Rupert was taken away, the weight on Willowdene seemed to lift, yet Whimsy knew the fragile peace was but a momentary reprieve in a world where human nature's darker urges never fully faded. The march of truth was never swift or easy, but it was, in the end, inevitable. And as he looked out over the moor, under a sky now clearing to pale blue, Whimsy allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The smoke had cleared. The secrets had been laid bare. The game, at least for now, was over. The crisp morning light filtered through the tall mullioned windows of Langley Hall's library, casting elongated patterns across the worn Persian rug, where Lord Peter Whimsy sat engrossed in a volume of Elizabethan poetry. Yet his thoughts were far from pastoral musings. The recent confession of Rupert Marchbanks had unravelled a web of deceit, but as always, Whimsy knew that the final threads were the most delicate, and often the most telling. Adelaide Venn stood by the window, her eyes distant as she clutched the silver locket. "It seems almost impossible, Lord Peter, that such malice could thrive beneath these very roofs for so long." Whimsy closed his book with a soft snap, a wry smile touching his lips. "Ah, but Miss Venn, human nature is the most fertile soil for shadows, especially when cloaked in civility and polished manners." Inspector Parker entered quietly, his expression grave yet respectful. "Sir, there's been a development. Cecily Hart has come to the conclusion that the diary is incomplete. Several pages appear to have been torn out." Whimsy arched an eyebrow. "A predictable measure. When one wishes to conceal inconvenient truths, one's hands become rather untidy." Cecily Hart arrived moments later, holding a tattered sheaf of loose papers. "I found these hidden within the false bottom of the desk drawer, Lord Peter. They seem to be fragments, notes, perhaps, or excerpts from the diary itself." He took the documents, scanning the cramped handwriting. "These could be the final puzzle pieces. Let us examine them closely." As the afternoon waned, the group pored over the newly discovered pages. They contained references to clandestine meetings, cryptic mentions of the council, and a chilling note that read, "If the truth emerges, all shall fall. Better the flames consume before tongues betray." Whimsy's gaze sharpened. The council, a shadowy conclave wielding influence not only over estates, but over the very fabric of society hereabouts. It seems our dear friends were not merely engaged in personal rivalry, but served a far-reaching design. Adelaide's voice was barely a whisper. A conspiracy, then? Against whom? Whimsy tapped the paper thoughtfully. Not against an individual, but against the very notion of justice and transparency. The diary threatened to illuminate their operations, so destruction, both literal and figurative, was their chosen weapon. As twilight approached, Whimsy arranged for a discreet inquiry into local archives and private correspondences, hoping to trace the council's members and unravel their connections. The truth, he mused, was a careful dance of patience and precision. That evening, as the household settled into uneasy quiet, Whimsy found himself wandering the long corridors of Langley Hall, the echoes of past conversations reverberating in his mind. The scent of old paper and faint smoke still lingered, reminders of the recent chaos. A soft knock drew his attention to a door ajar. Inside stood Cecily Hart, her eyes alight with newfound resolve. "Lord Peter, I've been reflecting on something. The diary's final warnings. It mentions a betrayal not by an outsider, but from within." An internal fracture, Whimsy mused. Indeed, the poison often festers in the heart. She hesitated, then produced a small, folded letter she had discovered earlier, unsigned but evidently written by one of the conspirators, expressing fear of exposure by a confidant. Whimsy took the letter, noting the trembling handwriting. "Fear begets treachery, Miss Hart. We must consider that even among those who conspired, loyalties were fragile and alliances transient." The following days were consumed with meticulous interviews, the piecing together of alibis, and the unveiling of subtle contradictions. Witnesses once reticent now revealed fractured alliances and whispered doubts. The tapestry of deceit, it seemed, had a fatal flaw: human frailty. One evening, Parker returned from the village with startling news. "Sir, I located a former servant of the Marchbanks household, an elderly woman named Mrs. Greaves. She claims to have witnessed a heated argument on the night of the fire between Blackwood and an unknown visitor." "An unknown visitor?" Whimsy's interest piqued. "Yes, sir. She describes a figure cloaked in shadow, but distinctly different from any family member or known associate." Whimsy's mind raced. Another player emerges from the mists. The plot thickens. Determined to identify this mysterious visitor, Whimsy organized a careful stakeout of the village's few remaining inns and gathering spots. Hours of patient observation paid dividends when a stranger fitting the description was spotted, a man with a slight limp and a keen, watchful eye. Confronted, the man introduced himself as Harold Vane, a solicitor with distant ties to the region. His demeanor was cautious, but not overtly hostile. Whimsy probed gently, weaving his questions with studied detachment. "Mr. Vane, your presence in the vicinity of Langley Hall on that fateful night is most curious. Care to explain?" Vane's eyes flickered with something: fear, guilt, or perhaps calculation. "I was called there on urgent business, matters of property and trust." Nothing more. But the argument with Blackwood, Whimsy pressed. Vane's composure cracked slightly. "It was heated, yes, but purely professional. Blackwood had concerns about the documents and their impact. I advised caution." "Caution that involved fire." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Or something more incendiary." Vane hesitated, then confessed. "Blackwood had enemies beyond the family. I warned him of dangers, but he was reckless. The fire was a desperate act, and others had a hand in its orchestration." Whimsy nodded slowly. the pieces aligning. The conspiracy was broader and more insidious than even Rupert's confession had revealed. That night, as the household gathered, Whimsy laid out his deductions. Langley Hall is a battleground for power, loyalty, and fear. The fire was not just to destroy documents, but to silence voices and shift allegiances. But human error and divided wills have granted us a window. His gaze swept the room. Our task now is to seal that window, to ensure that truth, fragile though it is, endures. With the dawn breaking, Whimsy prepared to confront the remaining conspirators, confident that the final act in this drama would reveal not only the culprits, but the human motives, the tangled threads of jealousy, ambition, and desperation that had fanned the flames at Willowdene. As the mist lifted over the moor, so too did the veil of secrecy. Justice, at last, was within reach, balanced delicately on the razor edge of reason and revelation. Langley Hall's drawing room was heavy with a tension as palpable as the lingering scent of smoke from the fire that had so recently scarred its history. Lord Peter Whimsy stood before the assembled household, a constellation of anxious faces illuminated by the flickering fireplace, and allowed himself a slow, measured smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone archly courteous yet edged with the precision of a scalpel, "we have traversed a labyrinth of half-truths, omissions, and silences. What remains is to illuminate the final shadow, to reveal how the flames at Willowdene were not merely an act of destruction, but a carefully staged performance designed to veil a deeper deceit." He paused, letting the gravity settle. The diary, the torn pages, the whispered threats, each a piece in a puzzle of ambition and betrayal. Rupert Marchbank's confession, while candid, was but the opening act. Whimsy's gaze fixed on Mr. Blackwood, whose composure had frayed under the weight of scrutiny. "You, sir, have danced a precarious waltz of loyalty and self-preservation. Your repeated insistence on your innocence was persuasive, until we examined the soundproofing peculiarities of the study and the time discrepancies noted by Inspector Parker." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I do not understand your insinuations." "Ah, but you do. The locked door you claimed was secure was in fact manipulated, a mechanism adjusted to create the illusion of impenetrability. It allowed for a visitor to slip unseen, delivering the incendiary that sparked the fire." He turned to Cecily Hart, who stepped forward with a small charred fragment of paper. "This, recovered from the ashes, bears the faintest imprint of a name: Vane." Harold Vane's presence here was no coincidence, but a deliberate intrusion on behalf of the conspirators. The solicitor, sitting stiffly, swallowed. "I admit I advised caution, but my intentions were to prevent ruin, not to incite it." Whimsy's smile deepened, though without warmth. "Intentions are often veiled in the language of self-interest, Mr. Vane. Your argument with Blackwood was not about property alone, but about controlling the narrative, the documents that threatened to expose the council's manipulations." Adelaide Venn, standing quietly by the window, spoke softly. "So it was to protect the council's secrets that the fire was set, to silence the diary and intimidate anyone who might seek the truth." "Precisely," Whimsy confirmed. "But the council's web was tangled enough that its own strands became a noose. The fear of exposure bred paranoia, leading to betrayal from within, an internal fracture." He addressed the room with finality. "The culprit, however, is not the mere arsonist or the cautious solicitor, but the mastermind who orchestrated the entire plot. Rupert Marchbanks himself." Gasps fluttered through the room. Whimsy explained, "Rupert was not only the victim of circumstance, but also an architect of this chaos. His duplicity was masked by feigned loyalty, but his ambitions led him to conspire with the council, only to betray them when convenient. The diary's destruction was his attempt to erase evidence of his double dealings, and the fire a desperate act to control damage." Rupert, pale and defeated, lowered his gaze. Your final betrayal, Whimsy continued, was to manipulate the confidences of others, to sow suspicion, and to conceal your own culpability behind a smokescreen of deceit. The inspector stepped forward, ready to take Rupert into custody. Whimsy concluded with characteristic irony, and so the shadows that once cloaked Langley Hall begin to recede. The flames may have consumed paper and wood, but they could not consume the truth, no matter how deeply it was hidden in smoke. As Rupert was led away, Adelaide approached Whimsy. And what will become of the council? Whimsy lit a cigar, the amber glow briefly illuminating his thoughtful face. Ah, Miss Venn, such organizations are like the weeds in a garden, occasionally uprooted, but inevitably new shoots will emerge. Our task is merely to ensure that vigilance, like careful pruning, keeps them at bay. With a final quip, he added, "After all, as Horace said, nunc est bibendum. Now is the time for drinking, and I think I have earned a glass or two." The room lightened with a shared smile, the weight of secrets lifting, if only for a moment. Lord Peter Whimsy's silhouette receded into the shadows of Langley Hall's ancient corridors, leaving behind a world a little less mysterious and a little more just.